What are your thoughts on knowledge checks? How do you adjudicate knowledge checks, and whether or not you should even have them? I mean, that's a controversial topic too. How do you adjudicate knowledge in your games?
So typically, typically what I end up doing with like knowledge checks is I do use knowledge checks, and um, part of this is like, so let me back up one step. Going back to what we were just talking about, I think it's important to identify in general what stuff actually needs a check. Like one thing you talked about in the section of the book you looked at this morning, for example, is the concept of defaulting to yes. That in general, a GM's response to anything that players say, the first thing you should say is there any reason I can't say yes to this? And usually the answer is no, so you should go ahead and say yes. And like the example often given in role-playing game manuals is like, oh, so the PCs want to cross the street. Don't call for an athletics check. They can just cross the street. That's something anybody can do. And what I think can be really eye-opening as a game master is to think about, okay, but now I'm playing Green Lantern or Superman or Hercules or a 15th level D&D character. What are the things that they don't actually need to make those checks for? You actually want to think about that in terms of making those rulings. And knowledge checks is a place where I think sometimes we can kind of fall into a trap where like things that anybody who is familiar with arcane lore should just be automatic. You don't necessarily make that check. But I will make checks because there's lots of stuff where I'm like, okay, well, maybe not everybody would know this, or not every scholar, not every spellcaster would know this, for example. But there's a couple things that let me get away with that. One is that the 3-clue rule I was talking about earlier. Like one trap you can fall into is if you only have a single point of failure where you have to know this piece of information in order to proceed with the adventure, you don't make that check. You have to, if you're at a single point of failure and the only outcome you're going to be comfortable with is success, again, you have to just go with the success. So by using the 3-clue rule, for example, it's okay to sometimes miss clues because that's the whole point of having that redundancy. And that can be interesting because it creates variations in what happens at the table. So that's why I'm comfortable using knowledge checks, is because usually I have some backup for that, and I'm only using them for things where they're not essential knowledge that the PCs have to have, and it's just interesting to kind of like see whether or not people know things. For the same reason, it's interesting to know whether or not they can jump over that chasm or whether or not they can pick that lock. And if those are the types of knowledge checks you're doing where like it's interesting either way, whether they know this or they don't, then the check becomes viable, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.